The room was unusually quiet. You could almost hear the soft rustle of uniforms, the nervous breathing of young soldiers, the cold metal echo of chairs being pulled into place. This was not a battlefield yet. The tension felt like one. And in the middle of this military meeting, where every face should have belonged to the nation, sat several unfamiliar men, foreigners, advisors, observers, men who had entered the room so easily that it felt like they had always belonged there. But then something happened that no one expected. A senior African official rose slowly, looked around the room, and pointed directly at the visitors. His voice did not tremble. "Please stand up and leave. Go home." The soldiers froze. The foreigners blinked. For decades, in meeting after meeting across the continent, foreign military cooperators had been treated as if their presence were natural, even necessary. But this time, the message was different. Our sons, our brothers, our young people in uniform are intelligent. They can handle everything themselves. For many Americans over 60, this moment may feel strangely familiar. It echoes old debates from the Cold War, Vietnam, the Middle East, moments when nations asked who really controls our security, who makes decisions when foreign advisors sit in the room. And so a deeper question rises from that tense meeting room in Burkina Faso. When an African state finally asks outsiders to step aside, is it reclaiming sovereignty or stepping into danger? Before we move on, I want you to hold that image, a room full of young soldiers, suddenly realizing that for the first time in their lives, their destiny will be decided by their own hands, not by those watching them. This video explores that turning point, the fight for military independence, the struggle over currency, medicine, food, and the future of Burkina Faso under leaders like Ibrahim Traoré who say, "We are ready to die for this." If you want to understand what sovereignty truly means in Africa today, and why global powers are quietly watching every step, stay with me. If you believe that truth matters more than headlines, please subscribe. And if you feel you're among the first to witness a new chapter for Burkina Faso, share this video. The moment the foreign advisors stepped out of the room, a different kind of silence filled the air. It wasn't fear, it was realization. For the first time in decades, a military meeting in this part of Africa would continue without the quiet scrutiny of foreign eyes, without whispered guidance, without the subtle pressure that had shaped national decisions since the 1960s. What came next was not just a statement. It was a declaration of a new era. The official looked around at the young soldiers, gendarmes, and officers seated before him, men and women who had grown up hearing that Africa needed help, that African armies must lean on partners, that intelligence and discipline could only come from the outside. Then he said something that reshaped the entire purpose of that gathering. Our young people in uniform are intelligent. They can do everything. They do not need someone with lighter skin to think for them. Those words hit the room harder than any command. Because everyone present knew the truth for years. Even the most sensitive military discussions included cooperants, militaires, étrangers. Decisions about borders, counterterrorism, weapons, logistics, nothing was ever fully African. Outsiders always sat there quietly influencing the direction of the country. But this time, the official did not stop at symbolic gestures. He revealed the hidden chains that had held the nation hostage. He described how, for generations, secret agreements signed by former presidents forbade African states from changing their military partners without consulting those same foreign powers. Agreements no citizen had ever voted for. Agreements that treated sovereignty like a borrowed item. Then he delivered the core message: we will change partners, and we are ready to die for it. This was not rhetoric. He explained how the moment an African state tries to buy weapons independently, a predictable chain reaction begins. First, the regional organizations intervene, the ECOWAS bureaucracy demands explanations. Then, the European Union follows, insisting on procedures. Finally, France steps in with a veto blocking the purchase entirely. Even when a state manages to secure a deal, banks refuse loans. We do not finance lethal equipment. As if the people defending their own country against terrorism and insurgency were somehow less entitled to weapons than nations with larger armies. The official exposed another hypocrisy, one that hit the soldiers especially hard. He revealed that some of the same countries telling Africa do not buy weapons elsewhere were secretly purchasing from those exact suppliers, rebranding them and selling them back to Africa at a higher price. It wasn't partnership. It was profit, disguised as friendship. Once the security system was laid bare, the official moved to the political front. He asked bluntly, since 1960, what haven't we tried? Every form of election, every imported institution, and what has it produced? He described the familiar cycle: a Western-backed leader takes a loan for a project worth 10 billion, claims everything is clean and transparent, then quietly steals 4 billion and deposits it abroad. The foreign banks know, the foreign governments know. But none of them speak up because corruption has always been a tool of influence. Then he proposed something that startled even the elders in the room: a new foundation for leadership itself. Not imported constitutions, not promises made during campaigns, but a solemn vow made on ancestral soil. He described a ritual where anyone elected or appointed must kneel on the land of their forefathers and swear never to betray the nation. If they do, the ancestors, those beneath the soil, have the right to call them back within 3 days. It was a spiritual form of accountability, but also deeply practical. It demanded humility, integrity, and memory. To reinforce the point, he invoked Japan, a nation Americans respect deeply for its discipline. He described how Japanese envoys kneel before their leaders, lift a handful of earth, and swear that the nation's honor stands above their own life. Then he listed the 7 virtues of service: courage, integrity, dignity, honor, patriotism. Why, he asked, is it acceptable in Japan but considered superstition in Africa? By the end of this first section, the message was unmistakable. True sovereignty begins the moment a nation decides to remove foreign hands from its security and foreign influence from its leadership. And that decision had just been made. What came next in that meeting, after the foreign advisors had left and the truth about secret agreements had been exposed, pushed the entire room into a new emotional terrain. The first part of the speech revealed the hidden chains, but the second part revealed the weapons used to tighten them: currency, medicine, food, and even the bodies of children. It was here that the official's voice grew sharper, more personal, as if he were speaking not only to the soldiers in front of him, but to every African parent and every elder who had watched generations fall to invisible battles. He began with the Franc CFA, a currency that many in the room had used since childhood without ever questioning its architecture. He held up a banknote. This, he said, is the last colonial chain. He explained how a 10,000 CFA bill from Burkina Faso cannot be used directly in Central African CFA countries. The soldiers looked puzzled. Many had assumed it was the same currency, but it wasn't. There were 2 systems, and both were routed through European oversight. He described how every time African nations trade, convert money, or buy equipment, the transactions quietly pass through European banks, which skim off value before sending the remainder back. That, he said, is why some leaders pretend not to see the problem. They no longer see money passing through their hands. Then he revealed the real fear among global powers: the moment Africa creates its own currency, the siphon dries up. For the first time, the soldiers understood why powerful nations reacted nervously whenever African leaders mentioned a new monetary system. It wasn't about stability, it was about control. Then the room shifted again as he moved to the subject that touched every family: health. He asked, what exactly do we swallow? What do our children get injected with? Who controls the formulas? No one answered, because no one knew. He gave an example so shocking that even veteran officers leaned forward in disbelief. A prescription written in Africa cannot be filled in Europe because none of the medicines match. Not the brands, not the formulas, not even the ingredients. What are we being given, he asked, and why is it different? Then came the statement that tore open the emotional core of the room. What proof do we have that they have not programmed our death in 10 or 15 years? Young soldiers shifted uneasily, older ones lowered their eyes. He listed the trends: rising infertility among young adults, unexplained hypertension in 12 and 14-year-olds, aggressive family planning programs that place injections into the arms of girls who have never even had a first child. He was not claiming certainty, he was expressing fear. The fear of a continent that has received medicines it did not design, vaccines it did not verify, and formulas it did not fully understand. Then he pointed to a path forward, returning to plantas medicinales, training new chemists, combining ancestral science with modern laboratories. Our elders are scientists, he said. They know exactly which route to pick at what hour and in what season. That knowledge must not die. This was not nostalgia. It was survival. Then he touched the deepest wound of all food: the betrayal that sits silently on every dinner table. He described a tiny cup of rice poured into a large pot swelling far beyond its natural volume. Soldiers nodded. They had all seen it, but they had not questioned it. What was inside that rice, he asked. Then he compared two identical cans of powdered milk, one sold in Africa, one in Europe. Look at the ingredients, he said. They are not the same. He explained that some food products sent to Africa were so low in quality they were not allowed for animal consumption in Western countries. Murmurs filled the room, not anger, but hurt, because everyone present had fed those products to their children. Then he announced the government's counterattack national food production agricultural machinery, arriving in bulk ancestral ceremonies, calling for rain, and rain returning abundantly for 2 consecutive years. Next year, he said with a half smile, our elders will pour an entire canary of water. The room laughed softly, but the message was deadly serious. Africa must eat what Africa grows. By this point, the soldiers were no longer simply listening. They were breathing with him. Some clenched their fists, some wiped their eyes. Some sat in stunned silence as if their entire understanding of daily life money, medicine, food had been overturned. What began as a military meeting had transformed into a spiritual confrontation with the structures that shaped their existence. And the official ended this section not with fear, but with fire. This is not conspiracy. This is survival. If we do not protect ourselves, no one will. If the first part of the speech exposed the hidden chains and the second part revealed the weapons used to weaken a nation from within, then this third section confronted the human cost, the wounds carried by ordinary people, by families, by soldiers, by the dead who never returned home, and by the living who struggled to understand what their suffering truly meant. This was no longer about economics or policy. It was about dignity. The official began by addressing the legal humiliation many Africans had quietly accepted for decades, the idea that a leader from the continent could be arrested, flown across the world, and judged by strangers in a courtroom that had never known African soil. He didn't shout. He simply asked, why should an African be judged outside of Africa for governing his own people? Then he warned of a darker truth. Even when these leaders return home after a few years in international prison, they rarely live long. What was in the food they ate, the water they drank, the light in their cell? The soldiers in the room exchanged glances. Everyone had heard stories, weakened bodies, failing organs, sudden deaths. He announced clearly, Burkina Faso will leave the International Criminal Court, not to excuse wrongdoing, but to reclaim the right to judge its own. A confederal court of justice would be created, African judges for African cases. It was a political earthquake. But for many listening, it felt like justice returning home after a long exile. Then came the emotional core, the history of African soldiers taken to Europe during World War II. He described how thousands were pulled from their villages, marched across coasts and islands, pushed into ships, and carried to battlefields where snow froze their fingers, but not their resolve. He told of executions along the route, unmarked graves, bodies abandoned in foreign soil, and how after the war, wounded but healed soldiers were deliberately kept in Europe. Because if they returned home, he said their children would ask questions, and Europe feared those answers. Then he struck the table gently, almost as a prayer. We will no longer call them tirailleurs. They were the liberators of Europe. In that moment, the room felt connected to centuries of forgotten courage, a lineage of sacrifice erased by textbooks that glorified generals but ignored the African men who fought in their armies. Rewriting history was not symbolic. It was an act of political defiance. His tone softened when he shifted to everyday life. He described a familiar scene, children visiting a friend's home, laughing, playing, and a guest asking, "How many children are yours?" The parent would point to 3, but among the group some were orphans, some came from broken homes, some had lost a father on the battlefield. Are we not sick? He asked if we ignore the children who look at us with hope. He reminded them of an ancient law, the Charter of Kurukan Fuga 1236, which declared that a child belongs to the community. Then he asked the soldiers to think of death not as an end, but as a measure of society's values. When we die, he said, who washes our body, who digs the grave, who places us into the earth, not the ministers, not the officials mentioned in funeral speeches, but the men who dig with their hands the unseen pillars of society. He urged the room, honor them, remember them. They carry our dead. They carry our dignity. Then he turned to the soldiers directly. A young man may go to war and return with all limbs intact. The nation celebrates him. But what about his mind? What about the night he first saw a body torn apart? What about the screams he cannot forget? He said, "You think he is unharmed because he walks, but inside something has been broken." To fix this, he proposed a radical idea. Every newly appointed official must spend 1 to 2 weeks on the front lines before taking office. Not to fight, but to witness. To see the torn earth, the burned villages, the intestines scattered after a bombing. So that when a report reaches their desk asking for equipment or medical support, they respond not with bureaucracy, but with urgency. This idea stunned the room not because it was extreme, but because it was profoundly humane. By the end of this section, one truth had become unavoidable. Political sovereignty without social healing is impossible. Food, medicine, money, justice, memory, family, and mental health all were battlegrounds, and if one collapses, the entire nation falls with it. For an American audience, especially those who have witnessed the Cold War, Vietnam, the Middle East, and the shifting sands of global power, what happened in that military meeting is not just an African event, it is a geopolitical signal, a shift, a tremor that Washington, Paris, Brussels, and even Beijing cannot ignore. The officials' words, "We will change partners, and we are ready to die for it," echoed far beyond the room. In Western capitals, statements like this are rarely dismissed as emotion. They are examined as intention, as strategic alignment, as the possible opening scene of a new geopolitical realignment in the Sahel. Because whenever a country talks openly about currency independence, medical autonomy, or judicial separation from international courts, it sends a message the old system is losing its grip. And yet, from an American perspective, this is a complicated story. Many Americans over 60 grew up during a time when U.S. foreign policy was shaped around one principle: prevent adversaries from gaining influence in strategic regions. Africa, for decades, was viewed through the lens of competition, first against the Soviet Union, now against China. So when a leader in Burkina Faso rejects foreign advisors, criticizes international banks, questions pharmaceutical imports, and leaves the International Criminal Court, Washington policymakers notice, not because they oppose African sovereignty, but because they wonder if not with us. Then, with whom older Americans have seen versions of this before: Iran in 1979, Cuba in the 1960s, Vietnam questioning foreign influence, Latin American countries nationalizing mines and banks. The pattern is familiar. When a nation asserts full sovereignty, great powers hold their breath. For Europe, especially France, the speech is more than political defiance. It is a rewriting of the rules of engagement. If Franc CFA collapses, European banks lose a financial structure that has quietly shaped African economies for decades. If African courts replace the ICC for African cases, Europe loses a moral instrument it once used to influence governance. If African nations start manufacturing their own medicine and food, Europe loses leverage built through exports disguised as aid. European diplomats understand the symbolism. A nation that reclaims its military meetings is a nation ready to reclaim everything else. For many older Americans, the officials' concerns about medicine, food supply, and foreign influence may sound less like politics and more like echoes of debates at home: distrust of pharmaceutical giants, questions about processed food, concerns about foreign-made medicine, political fatigue with institutions perceived as distant or unaccountable. This is why Americans over 60 can uniquely understand the emotional weight of his words, because they too have lived through moments when their own nation questioned what was safe, what was real, and who was in control. When he said, "What proof do we have that they have not programmed our death in 10 or 15 years?" it resonated with global fears about transparency in medicine, not just African fears. When he described food with altered ingredients, swelling rice, and mismatched formulas on canned milk, it echoed concerns many American parents once had during the baby formula shortages or when foreign products were recalled for safety. The struggle in many ways is universal. To the outside world, especially to watchers of Africa, news speeches like this do not appear random. They reflect a broader movement rising across the continent, one embodied by leaders like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, who speak openly about dignity, self-reliance, and the dangers of dependency. To Washington, this movement is both a challenge and an opportunity. To Europe, it is a reckoning. To Asia, it is a door opening. To Africa, it is a homecoming. If you were leading a country where foreign advisors sat in every major meeting, where your currency was controlled abroad, where your medicine was imported without transparency, and where your history was written by others, would you not want to reclaim control too? The meeting that began with a simple command, "Please stand up," and leave, ends with something far larger than a change in seating. It marks the reopening of a question the world has spent decades trying to silence: who truly owns the destiny of an African nation? As the official finished speaking, the soldiers did not applaud. They didn't move. They didn't whisper. They simply absorbed the full weight of everything they had heard, that sovereignty is not a slogan, but a battlefield. Not a flag, but a responsibility. Not a gift, but a fight that touches money, medicine, food, memory, and even the souls of the dead. He reminded them, and all of us listening, that a nation can lose itself quietly, not through invasion, but through habits, comforts, and borrowed systems that feel normal, simply because they have existed too long. The most dangerous chains are the ones that no longer feel like chains, and so he left them with a warning: do not be fooled by those who seem in a hurry. Some are sent by our enemies. The road ahead is long. What remains to be done is greater than what we have already accomplished. For anyone watching from the United States, especially Americans who have lived long enough to see empires rise and fall, these words should not be dismissed as distant African concerns. They echo the same truths that shaped your own history: that independence must be defended repeatedly, that institutions must serve the people who built them, and that no nation survives if it forgets who it is. Because in the end, what this moment in Burkina Faso represents is not anger, but awakening; not rebellion, but remembrance. It is a continent struggling to reclaim what was always its own dignity-control future. And leaders like Ibrahim Traoré are forcing the world to confront that shift. Whether the global powers like it or not, whether Washington or Paris agrees or disagrees, Africa is entering a chapter it intends to write itself. For the first time in generations, Africa news is no longer about crisis, but about courage. So let me ask you directly: do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's push for national sovereignty is the path Africa needs, or is it a risk too great? Would you support a leader who refuses to let foreign powers decide his nation's medicine, currency, and history? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters more than you think. And if you believe that truth should come before headlines, please subscribe. If you feel you are among the first to truly understand what's unfolding today in Burkina Faso, share this video so others can see the story for themselves.